In this slideshow, we're going to be looking at ancient Athens, which besides Sparta was the other major superpower in classical Greece. So unlike Sparta, Athens' primary focus was not on military strength. Athens' power came more from its economic abilities. It was a trading center, and it became very rich in this way. And it was also a major naval power, and it was a cultural superpower as well. Lots of the famous ideas that we associate with ancient Greece and lots of the famous art came from Athens. For example, the Parthenon, which you see there, was built in Athens during its golden age when it was very rich and powerful and influential. These are the terms that you should be familiar with: Draco, Solon, Cleisthenes, direct democracy, citizen, agora, and rhetoric. And you should be able to answer these questions by the time the video is over. So let's start by talking about geography, as we like to do here. So as you can see on the map there, Athens is on a little peninsula that sticks out into the Aegean Sea. It's right next to the Peloponnese. It's about 30 miles, I think, to Sparta from Athens, so a couple days walk. Athens was a really good little spot, and for that reason it had been occupied since Neolithic times. So for thousands of years people had lived around Athens. One of the main reasons is there was a hill there that was easily defendable. You could build a little fort up on top of it and you'd be safe from attacks by neighboring cities. So anyway, around 800 BC, Athens had emerged as one of the most powerful cities on that little peninsula, and it was actually able to dominate the area around it and build up a little state. They were able to control the lands around it. They were able to control a port city nearby and start trading with other people. And they were a prosperous city until around 650 BC. There was a period of turmoil. Things were unstable, and so to deal with this instability, the Athenians put this guy named Draco in charge. They basically gave him full control of the city and told him to do whatever it took to restore stability to the region. So Draco, in response to this, established the first written law code in Athens. And this written law code, a lot like Hammurabi's law code, was very harsh. And that's where we get our modern word draconian. So if you don't like the rules at a school that you're going to, you can describe those rules, if you think they're super harsh, as draconian, and people will think you're very smart and then ignore you and make you follow the rules anyway. So Draco implements these super harsh law codes and restores order, and he also does something very important. He expands political participation in Athens to any man who can buy his own weapons. So before this, Athens was ruled by sort of like tribal leaders, chiefs, but now Draco says that anybody who is willing to fight in the Athenian army and who can buy his own weapons, like his spear and his shield and his armor and stuff like that, gets a say in how Athens is run. So this is the very beginning of Athens' progress towards becoming a democracy. So there's another influential leader who comes a little bit later, and his name is Solon. And so what had happened after Draco is Athenian society had become very unequal. There were a couple people up at the top who were really rich and who had lots of stuff. And then there were lots and lots of poor people and slaves who served these rich people. Solon didn't think that this was the right way for Athens to be going, and so did lots of the people who were poor and slaves. So they supported Solon, and Solon came to power, and he was able to reform Athens to make it a more equal society. So he forgave debts to people who were in debt to the rich people. He redistributed lands so that more people had a decent-sized amount of land that they could farm. And he also made it illegal for Athenian citizens to sell themselves into slavery. And so what this did is this created a large group of Athenians who were all wealthy enough to buy weapons. And so this allowed for more people in Athens to participate in Athenian government. So this is another step towards democracy. By creating more equality and kind of creating a middle class in Athens, Solon was able to expand participation in Athenian government. one of the main things that Athens is famous for is democracy. And so we need to look a little bit more at that. So the Athenian governmental system was based on the reforms of Draco and Solon, who we just looked at, and also, very importantly, this guy named Cleisthenes. And so Cleisthenes is very important because what he does is he takes the reforms of Draco and Solon a step further and expands the right to participate in government to all Athenian citizens. So he says, regardless of how much money you have, as long as you are an Athenian citizen, you get to participate in what goes on in the government. And the type of democracy that Cleisthenes creates is called a direct democracy. And a direct democracy is a type of democracy where anybody who's a citizen plays a direct role in governing the city. So they don't just vote for people who go and make the laws, but every citizen actually participates in creating the laws. They write the laws and they vote on the laws, and they also serve as judges in legal cases. So if somebody gets in trouble in the city, they don't just go to a little court and the judge decides, but all the citizens would meet up and decide if the guy was guilty or not. And so this is the system of direct democracy that Cleisthenes creates. And it sounds pretty advanced and like progressive from a modern point of view. One other thing before we move on is that so all the governmental positions, stuff like governor or people who would oversee like trade or building stuff in the city, all of those positions that where normally you would just get in our system, you would just get appointed or elected, were filled randomly by lot. So that meant that there was like basically a big hat with all the citizens' names in it. And every year or however long, they would draw out names to decide who was going to fill each role. So it'd be like, okay, turns out you get to be governor, good luck. You get to be chief of construction, good luck, and so on. And so this was a very, very serious system where the citizens were expected to devote much of their lives to running the city. But we need to think for a second about what actually qualified as a citizen. So a citizen in Athens was not just anybody, right? It was actually a very small percentage of the total population. In order to be a citizen and to participate in government, you had to be free, that is, you couldn't be a slave. You had to be an adult male, so you can't be a child or a woman. And you have to serve in the military. So basically what you're doing is if you're a free adult male who was born in Athens, you would have to risk your life to defend the city if you wanted to participate in government. So it's kind of like a trade-off. And so when you take all of this into account, it represented only between 10 and 20% of the total population. Everybody else, slaves, women, children, foreigners, were not allowed to vote and had no say in how the city was run. So this raises a good question of, was Athens actually a democracy? If only 10 to 20% of the people actually get to participate, is it actually a democracy? That's a good debate. We should talk about that in class. Besides democracy, Athens is also very famous for its culture. It's seen as the birthplace of philosophy, of drama, of other stuff like that. So let's talk about this a little bit. One thing that was very central to Athenian culture was this place in the middle of town called the Agora. And the Agora was not like an official governmental site, but it was actually just a public market where people would show up to sell their goods. And it was also a meeting place where prominent Greeks, that is, rich citizens, would just all hang out there all day. And they would exchange ideas with each other. So they would go around and say, hey, I really think the city should do this. How are you going to vote in this upcoming thing? So it was kind of the heart of the Athenian democracy. People would just chill here all day and talk about ideas for government or economics or other stuff like that. Also, Athens had a very specific idea of how children should be educated, and it's very different from the Spartan system of education. The two cornerstones of Athenian education were gymnastics and rhetoric. So gymnastics was what it basically, more than just what it means today, it basically was just a regime of physical fitness. Young men would go and they would train to keep themselves healthy and strong primarily because you need healthy, strong men to fight in the army, and you need an army to keep your city safe. One funny thing about gymnastics is you would go to the gymnasium, and the gymnasium literally means in Greek, the place of nakedness. And it was called this because when the ancient Greeks did gymnastics, they all practiced entirely naked. Also, in the original Olympics, everybody competed entirely naked because they believed that was the most fair way to compete, because different types of clothing or shoes or whatever could give you an unfair advantage. Anyway, that's a random aside. So gymnastics was important for keeping the citizens strong and healthy and ready to fight, but more importantly was rhetoric. And rhetoric is the art of effective public speaking. So whenever you see somebody give a speech or whatever, they're using rhetoric. And so why was rhetoric so important in Athenian culture? It was important because in a direct democracy, whoever was the best public speaker could usually get their way. So if you really wanted the city-state to do something, you had to stand up and convince everybody else that this was the right way to do things. And so if you wanted to get your way, you would have to learn to speak really well. And so what happened here is young men from wealthy or influential families would pay these special tutors called sophists. And sophists would basically teach these young men how to make persuasive arguments. They'd teach them how to speak eloquently, they'd teach them how to use logic, and also how to appeal to their listeners in order to convince their listeners to do this or that. We'll look at an example of some Greek rhetoric tomorrow or in the next couple days, where this guy over in the picture, Pericles, is going to basically try to convince the Athenians to do what he wants them to do. Just a few more things about Athenian culture. We could go on a long time and talk about Athenian art or the Acropolis or the beginnings of Greek philosophy, but we're just going to look at these last two things. One, in Athens, women had no rights. And I think this is important to think about because we associate Athens with being like the birthplace of democracy and this really free and awesome and open society. But really, it was only free and open and awesome for a small percentage of men who lived in the city. Women had no political rights, and they were basically treated as property by their fathers and husbands. You were kept at your father's house, and you stayed there until you got married, and then you were basically transferred to your husband's house, and then you were expected to stay there and take care of the babies. That was the women's role in Athens, which, as you might remember, was way worse than the role that Spartan women got to play. So when you think about freedom, it's important to think about freedom for everybody in the society, not just for whoever is in charge. Also, one other thing, the Athenian economy, how they actually made most of their money, came from overseas trade. And it was through trade that Athens was able to become the wealthiest city-state. And also through trade, they come into contact with places all over the Mediterranean, Egypt, Phoenicia, Mesopotamia. And through this contact with other cultures, new ideas are introduced into Athens. And this is one reason that Athens becomes a cultural center, is because they're constantly bringing in and exchanging new ideas. And one last thing is because they had this trade, Athens develops a powerful navy. They build these warships called triremes, which you can see there, where they were actually powered mostly by rowers. And these triremes are going to be super important in the Persian Wars because it's only because of the Athenian navy that they're able to defeat the invading Persians and basically maintain their independence. So that's Athens. Trading power, cultural center, naval power. And we're going to see in our next video how Athens and Sparta actually come together to fight against the Persian Empire and to keep Greece independent. Thanks for watching. See you guys tomorrow.